Welcome. My name is Shia Cabas, and I serve as the Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. On behalf of BPC, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and the Institute for College Access and Success, we're glad you can join us for today's conversation about state finances and higher education funding. COVID-19 has upended daily life and the global economy. Beyond the tragic human toll, the economic fallout has been devastating. Jobs lost, businesses closed, and families struggling to make ends meet. The impact on state budgets has been especially severe, with some estimating that the total gap could exceed $500 billion over the next few years. We learned a decade ago that if those holes are left unaddressed, it will translate into serious consequences for not only public sector workers, but also the national economic recovery. The US higher education system in particular is dually threatened, with state budget crunches compounded by steep enrollment declines. How bad will it get? What will that mean for schools and their students? And what can be done to avoid the worst outcomes? Today's conversation seeks to provide some answers to these questions. We'll also discuss longer-term reforms that could better equip the higher education system to deal with future economic downturns. We are very glad to be joined today by a terrific group of experts whose bios can be found on the event page of BPC's website. For those of you viewing this event through Zoom, we encourage you to submit any questions you have for the panelists through the chat feature. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Shio and Tikas for co-hosting this event with us. In particular, we're grateful to Tom Harnish and Michelle Streeter for their collaboration. I also want to recognize the members of our team, particularly Mariette Aborn for her work behind the scenes, and Janan Batar, who will be moderating the upcoming panel discussion. And with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Chancellor Daniel Malloy. Chancellor Malloy has led the University of Maine system since 2019. With much of my family hailing from Stamford, Connecticut, though, I know him better as a 4-term mayor and 2-term governor. Instead of spending time detailing his accomplishments, I'm just going to leave you with the fact that we're honored to have him here with us today, especially given his unique leadership perspective coming from both sides of the state budget equation. Chancellor Malloy, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the introduction and the reference to my hometown of Stamford, Connecticut. I want to begin my comments by assuring everyone who was listening to the music on the hold, waiting for the conference to start, I did not choose the music. In all seriousness, it's great to be with you. Quite frankly, I'm a little overwhelmed at the idea that I've been asked to speak, but I understand why. Not so much my 10-month-long tenure as Chancellor of the University of Maine system, but rather, I guess, my political and governmental experience prior to that. But what I will attempt to do is to blend the two things for you, to have you understand what I'm thinking about, what I believe we're about to undergo, and how we might react to that. Like just about everyone watching this broadcast today, we went through the same upheavals together. On March 12th, we announced that within 10 days, we would take 210,000 hours of instruction and move it online exclusively, that we would evacuate our campuses, that we would begin the process of returning monies to desperate or needy families, and did so almost immediately. That we would be involved in discussions with political leaders, particularly in Washington, with respect to what a carve-out should be to support our field of endeavor, higher education, in the various CARES Act, and continuing that work to this very day. In the last 30 or so days, I think more of my time has been spent worrying about our future. How will we open? Is it online? Is it in person or in classroom, or some hybrid system that we'll use to make sure that we can provide the product that we are charged to do as a public entity? And there's so many things that we all have to balance in that regard. It seems a daunting task, perhaps overwhelming to some, but we will charge forward. We will get the job done. We will rise to the occasion once again, as we did in early March through the graduation, in our case, of over 4,500 of our students in the system. Going back, looking in the rearview mirror, if you will, I understand what we did was necessary. Perhaps it should have been done sooner with more planning and insight. There's always 20/20 vision when looking backwards, but I can assure you we won't commit some of the same mistakes in a future problem, having learned so many lessons just recently. You've asked me to speak about the challenges that we've referenced. And like many of you, our university system has lost a significant amount of money. And if we are not able to open with some form of in-classroom instruction, even as a part of a hybrid system of delivery, we can be assured that those losses will continue well into the future. As everyone watching understands, a lost class or a lost portion of any class lives with you at a minimum for 4 years, more likely for 6 years, and can be a daunting task to overcome. Therefore, our communications with students on an ongoing basis, new admits, new matriculating students, as well as those students that we depend on returning, has been at the forefront. It's one of the reasons we distributed CARES Act money before others did. It's one of the reasons that we were returning checks to our students within 7 days of having called our system to go virtual. But we also understood that we needed, in this context, to have the state of Maine understand why a university system is important to them. We have gone out of our way to tell the story of how we've supported the efforts of the broader state to recover from this gigantic setback. We've told that story time and time and time again, whether it's making sanitizer for hospitals when they couldn't get it on the marketplace, or sharing our own PPE stockpile with hospitals who were running short, or early graduating nurses, 197 nurse volunteers to the broader state were made available. And action after action, including housing the homeless in Portland, our largest city, to make sure that the chances of that population becoming infected would be diminished dramatically. Like you, we've done those things, and we've taken particular effort to tell the story, to have the people of Maine relate to the university that they are supporting through their tax dollars. We've also planned for what we'll need to do to handle those economic problems, just like all of you. And I won't bore you with the detail of what we're talking about doing, but suffice it to say that we understand we're going to have to survive on less money, because no matter what happens, it's unlikely that more students will come to our system rather than fewer systems, or that more money will come from a state government rather than less money. Let me let you in on something that those of you who've been around like myself might be thinking, well, I've been through this kind of challenge before. I was there in 2008 through 2012, and I understand the significance of the problem we're in. It's changed. The reality is that state budgets have far less money that they can share without a mandate. And I'll explain that further. Because of the growth of medical care through Obamacare and other initiatives that have been taken in the last 10 years, the actual divided portion of the monies that state government can disperse to other non-committed entities or enterprises is severely limited. In a place like Maine, where we look to receive about $225 million of our support, offsetting are helping to pay for our lower tuition, our lower room and board as a public university, we cannot assume that we'll be treated the same way we were treated in 8, 9, 10, or 11. In fact, we must assume that we'll be treated far worse than we've been treated before, because the legislature and elected leaders may not have a choice based on the federal commitments that they've made. I also would relate what I was talking about, telling our story. One of the reasons we've spent so much time telling that story is to have the people of Maine and the legislature understand what might be lost if we're not supported. It's not just that a class will be smaller, or fewer people will exercise the option to get a college education in what is becoming, I would argue, an anti-intellectual nation, if not world. A lost opportunity for economic growth because we're not providing the human capital to grow the economy of our state or our nation. These are things that we need to remind individuals about as we make that argument for the support that we've become accustomed to and reliant on. I can't promise you we'll do better than 2008 through 2011. In fact, I've already predicted we won't do as well. But it is incumbent upon us to tell our stories to the legislature, to elected leadership, governors in particular, so that we're understood for the total value that we return to a state. No state will succeed in recovering from the long-term effects of the COVID pandemic if we don't produce that human capital, which eventually and relatively quickly, I will say, will be needed to grow that economy. A few other things that I would like to share with you that I ruminate about on a daily basis, actually set aside time to devote to. There will be silver linings. There are lessons that we have learned. We will be stronger and better. I'll predict that our faculty are more attuned to how their students are reacting, even if it's on a TV screen, than they were on the 11th of March. That's going to stay with us. I will also say, because so many faculties opposed online learning for so long, we're now in a new world where people have tried it and many of them like it. And likewise, what we've also found out about students, although there is an overwhelming preference to maintain in-classroom learning, many students have made the adjustment and will find online learning, at least as part of their component education, attractive options for them. That's one of the reasons that in Maine, we're pushing a hybrid form where we could reestablish in-classroom learning. We, on a simultaneous basis, have that available to anyone, anywhere in the world. And also to have it up on call up, so students who, for one reason or another, missed a session can call it up and recall that learning that they may have missed. This hybrid form, this new world we're in, and this desire to be educated in other ways, as well as practice in providing it, I think will be one of the strengths going forward. And there are many other lessons that we should all list on the things that we've learned in the last few months. I hope my comments have been helpful to you, and it's great to be with you and to have a wonderful conference the remainder of the time.
Thank you, Chancellor. I think we are ready for our transition to the panel. Jeananne, are you with us to take the reins?
I am.
Great, we've got to get everyone video and mic'd up. There we go.
As we pull everyone up from the panel, I just want to say thank you, Shai, and thank you, Chancellor Mulwally, for kicking us off with your insights. We're really glad everyone's joining us. And again, shout out to Tikas and Shio for co-hosting this panel today. As a reminder, audience questions can be submitted using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to include your questions. That means we may combine some of the questions or pose a series of questions to the panelists. We also encourage you to use our hashtag on Twitter, BPC Live, or the handle BPC_bipartisan. Questions using the hashtag will be submitted to the chat for the panelists. Joining us today in the discussion, we have Catherine White, Director of Budget Process Studies for the National Association of State Budget Officers, James Quall, President, the Institute for College Access and Success, Jeff Andrade, Senior Vice President, McKeon Group, Daniel Greenstein, Chancellor, Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, and Alex Johnson, President, Cuyahoga Community College, and also the chair of the American Association of Community Colleges Board of Directors. You can find their bios online at the webpage. As for now, we'll jump right into the conversation. Catherine, help us set the stage. What did the state budgets look like before COVID-19? What are they looking like right now? And what parts of the state budgets will likely be most affected by the economic fallout from the crisis?
Sure. Thank you, Janan, and thank you for having me today. Honored to be with you all virtually. So before the COVID-19 crisis, state fiscal conditions were really strong overall, following a decade of revenue growth and strengthening reserves. Most states had seen 2 consecutive years of faster than expected revenue growth in fiscal year 2018 and 2019, which had led to some sizable budget surpluses in some cases. And it was in this fiscal environment that states were focused on investing in key priorities, while also being cautious about taking on too many new ongoing spending commitments, mindful that the next downturn could be around the corner. For the current fiscal year 2020, states in the aggregate had enacted spending increases of about 4.8%, and that included a sizable funding boost of $4.4 billion for higher education. And right before COVID hit, states were working on their budgets for fiscal year 2021, which for most states starts on July 1st. And they were planning for things like teacher pay increases and more funding for higher education institutions and tuition freezes, expanding promise programs, and making similar targeted investments in other areas of the budget, while also planning for additional increases to the rainy day funds, which were already at an all-time high. And then the pandemic happened, and it's affected state fiscal conditions sharply and dramatically, resulting in steep revenue declines in virtually all sources. As a bit of background, states rely on personal income taxes and sales taxes for roughly 75% of their general fund revenue. And obviously these sources are being hit hard in light of stay-at-home orders, business closures, and skyrocketing unemployment and layoffs. What we're witnessing is really a dramatic and unprecedented shift in state fiscal conditions for the worse over the course of just a couple months. And how bad is it, and how bad is it going to be? States have begun to release updated revenue forecasts that project the impacts of COVID over the next 1 to 2 years. And early analyses suggest potential revenue losses could be double what states experienced during the Great Recession. And it was during the Great Recession, states saw roughly an 11%, more than an 11% decline in revenues over 2 years from 2008 to 2010. A number of states have already come out to announce multi-billion-dollar budget shortfalls, and we expect others to be releasing updated projections in the coming weeks and months ahead as more data is available. So in this new fiscal environment, states are of course facing tough decisions, looking at cutting spending, instituting layoffs, weighing when to use the reserves they've worked so hard to build in recent years. And unlike the federal government, of course, states are required by law to balance their budgets. So this means that in a recession, as revenues decline, states have to cut their budgets even as demand for services increases. You know, states may look to tax increases and other strategies as well, but cutting spending is usually the first line of defense. And with all that said, of course, states are anxiously awaiting to see what additional aid will come from the federal government, aid that will be necessary to avoid even more drastic and painful cuts that will hurt their residents and significantly dampen the nation's economic recovery. Regarding your question about what areas of state budgets are likely to be more affected in this downturn, when states have to achieve significant budget reduction in order to balance, they'll need to look across program areas, including at those larger pots of money. And higher education is the third largest category of state budgets after K through 12 and Medicaid. And just as Chancellor and former Governor Malloy just talked about, Higher ed is considered to be more discretionary compared to those other two larger buckets. States have constitutional and other legal requirements for funding K through 12 education. Medicaid is an entitlement program jointly funded by the states and the federal government. And I would add that compared to past recessions, we expect states may find it even harder to cut Medicaid this time around, given the public health crisis. So for all these reasons, as well as the fact that higher ed has other revenue sources besides state funds, one can expect higher ed to be more affected by budget cuts. And this is, of course, what we've seen in past recessions as well, though this time it will be during a period when higher education's business model is also facing unprecedented obstacles during the pandemic. And so that's why this conversation today is so important.
Thank you, Catherine. You mentioned that state revenue losses could be, double the Great Recession. Can you provide just a little historical context? What were some of the major statistical points that happened for higher ed during the Great Recession? What losses did we see during those years?
Sure. So as I mentioned, state funding for higher ed has generally been cut disproportionately during past recessions, and that includes the Great Recession. So during the Great Recession, I mentioned states saw about 11.6% decline in general fund revenues over those 2 years, 2008 to 2010. Over that same period, state general fund spending on higher ed declined actually at a similar rate of 10.5%. However, those cuts to higher ed during those years were mitigated by federal stimulus funds that were provided by the Recovery Act, or ARA. So once ARA funding ran out, state spending on higher ed saw further declines. So even while other parts of state budgets were beginning to grow again, albeit slowly, higher ed saw further decline, so that by fiscal year 2012, general fund spending on higher ed was actually 17% lower than it had been in 2008. And that's all according to NASBO data, which is not adjusted for inflation or enrollment. So that's an absolute change. So.
Thank you, Catherine. That's super helpful. Thinking about budget reductions, that's a good way to transition. Chancellor or President Johnson, in Ohio, what budget reductions are currently taking place? How does this affect Tri-C and your students? And what do you think this will have an impact on your enrollment? Oh, I think we have.
Yes. Yeah. I hope you can hear me now. I apologize. This happens all the time, despite the fact that I do, in some instances, 5 or 6 of these a day. But we really want to thank you for the invitation to be here to share some insights from the ground on exactly how institutions are responding to not only COVID-19, but the financial challenges associated with it. Chancellor Malloy and also Catherine, I think, really provided a great foundation for this discussion this afternoon, because what they've done is put in perspective how states and ultimately institutions will be affected by all of this. And so that's why I believe now states are dependent upon support from the federal government in the form of the HEROES Act that has been passed by the Houses and is now in the Senate. But in our state of Ohio, the chancellor announced the governor announced a $775 million cut in the state budget just in this past quarter. For higher education, it was $110 million. And for institutions, it was about 4%. For us, is $3 million. If you extrapolate that over the course of a fiscal year, it means that the cuts can range between 16 and 20%, back to Catherine's point. And they might even get up to 25%, which would be extraordinarily devastating for institutions that rely heavily on state support. For us, it has affected the manner in which we conduct business. Certainly, we've had to reallocate resources. We've had to cut operating expenses. there will be some personnel actions that we have to undertake, and they will affect some really, really good people. So this environment can be not only devastating to the institutions, but to the communities and individuals that work there as well. I know part of the question that you want to pose, or the second part, relates to enrollment, and I can talk generally about that because what I understand from my conversations with other presidents is that they're going to be affected similarly. So if you want me to go into that right now, I can do that.
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit about what you're hearing and what your expectations for Tri-C are going into the fall on enrollment.
Right now, across the nation, community colleges are looking at somewhere between 15% and 20% down for the summer on average. Right now, we are fortunate. We are down about 5% in headcount enrollment and about 1.5% in full-time equivalent, which is how money in most states is extended to colleges. That's unusual for us. Usually our headcount enrollment is higher than our full-time equivalent, but it just means that fewer students at our institution are taking more classes. What we are seeing is a rise in out-of-state students who are accessing our coursework remotely because it's affordable. Some students would pay more taking remote courses in their state than they would out of state for us here at Tri-C. We're also seeing an increase in what we call dual enrollment students. Students are currently in high school and and their schools are closed, but want to continue their education in a meaningful way. The unfortunate thing, however, that we are witnessing is that for economically disadvantaged and minority students, their enrollment is actually down. So while we see 5% decrease in headcount, 1.5% decrease in full-time equivalent, we're seeing significantly more decreased enrollment for those groups. And certainly we have to really, really focus attention on those individuals that are very, very vulnerable at this time.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. Keeping it on the ground, I'm going to pass it over to Chancellor Greenstein. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania state system of higher ed, how are you responding to the changing fiscal environment? And what efforts have you seen in response to COVID that are intriguing you? Are there silver linings, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm an irrepressible optimist, so I'll say that out front. Yeah, these are profoundly challenging times, as others have represented well. I mean, I think it's difficult to underestimate the scale of this exogenous shock on the system. Having said that, we are public higher education. We have an obligation in service to our students, the state, our employers, the communities that we're located in. And we have, a long and noble history of surviving and thriving through a range of exogenous shocks over the last couple hundred years. And I'm confident that we will do that here as well. We were on a path here in Pennsylvania owing to a pretty significant structural financial weakness in our state system. We've lost 20% of our enrollment since 2010 in a period of declining state funding. So we were on a path to address those financial challenges, implementing a variety of shared service operations, but most intriguingly, most importantly, by thinking about how we could work together as 14 universities in a single system so that students anywhere in the state, anywhere in the system could have access to the full breadth of educational opportunity anywhere else in the system. So we could educate the people of Pennsylvania independently of their zip code as well as their background. That's a really powerful idea, especially if you think about a handful of institutions which are beginning to be so financially challenged that it's almost it's difficult for them to operate across the full range of academic programs that they would need to operate across in order to maintain enrollments. It's a very powerful model, and we were starting down that path, and along comes the pandemic, and we're accelerating that work. Because it is and there's opportunity in that. It's not about saving money. It's actually about expanding educational opportunity. I think there are other trends that we were, other directions that we were headed, which we're going to accelerate. Obviously, the interest in residential approaches to traditional education have been declining. I mean, we just have to own that fact. over the last decade or more, interest in online offerings have grown. So there's a great opportunity to leverage this experience to think about how we better serve a population of students. And of course, many will continue to want a residential experience. It's a good thing. But there are others who need other options, and there's opportunities for us to grow in that area. And then finally, I think the other thing that four-year institutions and higher in particular have been challenged by is understanding what their role, what their place is in the kind of lifelong learning, workforce aligned degree, but also non-degree credentialing. How do they partner with community colleges, employers, and other education providers to build pathways that are meaningful for students to pursue, into and through the careers that they wish to have. So those were three areas that we were working on. They were responsive to needs that were pre-pandemic. The pandemic is going to accelerate those, not accelerate the work. It will accelerate the work because it will exacerbate the need, right? Higher education, the workforce orientation, the social mobility is needed now in a post-pandemic world, probably more than ever. So, we have an opportunity, and I think honestly, we have a public obligation to pursue those opportunities, however difficult they may be, however much restructuring they might require. Our job is not to maintain a particular structure or headcount, our job is to serve our students, our communities, the state, and our employers. It's a tough job right now, but in some ways, it's a watershed opportunity.
Thank you, Chancellor Greenstein. It's great to hear that this is, giving institutions an opportunity to build more pathways for students. And thinking about all these challenges that our panelists on the ground have been talking about, I want to actually turn over to you, Jeff, and talk a little bit about the federal response going on. So how did the CARES Act address or not address many of these issues facing higher ed during this time?
Right. Well, thanks. I also want to thank you for having me on. I think first and foremost, what helped secure the funding that we're able to get in the CARES Act was the success of everyone in higher education working together to keep students on the path to graduation. Very surprisingly, you did not hear a lot of whining and people running around and panicking on this particular set of policies. They stayed focused. Faculty, staff members, students, people did what they needed to do, and they made a very large transition very quickly. And so when we went in, to talk to members of Congress and their staff about this and working with the associations and the schools, one of the things we were able to do is really to focus on the immediate cost to institutions. I mean, there was a sort of a double whammy. You had some revenue loss immediate. A lot of this revenue loss is going to be in the future, but you did have some immediate revenue loss. And you also had a lot of additional expenses, whether it be refunding students who were due money back on the residence halls and things like that, but also, penalties and some of the costs of social distancing. So what ended up, the $14 billion, more than half, I think, is going to be, we'll see at the end of the day, will go to students. I think that had a significant impact in helping to keep the momentum going that we saw. And, that was, think about going back, that was only the second, COVID bill. In looking at it from sort of, a little bit of hindsight, I think maybe, the assumption there was the need was evenly distributed and it was driven primarily by the percentage of needy students that you had. I think, it probably would have behooved them to hold a little bit more back based on unmet need for some institutions and have a mechanism similar to what we have in campus-based for having some institutions be able to return some funds and distribute it to institutions that had a little bit more impact. And I think, when I look at institutions, smaller institutions, I think on a per student basis probably had a much more significant impact having to make the transition online than maybe some of the larger institutions.
That was one of the questions I had, Jeff, was you talked, there's these immediate revenue losses for institutions. You work with a lot of different types of schools. What schools are you seeing the most impacted by the quick conversion to remote learning?
Well, I think, first and foremost, I think this whole situation drove home something that I and, many other advocates for quality online have been preaching, and that is that every institution ought to have some type of basic digital teaching and learning capacity. Now, that works great in sort of the classroom setting. Where I've seen issues is really primarily in two areas. One is in the area of nursing and the allied health professions, where a lot of the educational curriculum is based on clinical training, and that is clinical training in health settings, and that's been obviously very challenging in this current environment to do. And I think there probably needs to be some more discussion as a result of this, looking at telemedicine and some other options to provide for clinical settings. I think we're a little bit behind the curve there. The other area where I've seen is programs that require a lot of hands-on labs. I work with a large group of institutions that provide very high quality training in automotive technology, and they quickly moved like everyone else in the classroom and in their settings, but the students did not like the lab experience, because they were used to a hands-on, and what they've been able to do as some of these states have begun to open up is they've moved very quickly with a modified social distancing policy back to a safe lab type situation. So I think those were the two big aspects that I saw where online learning was great and it was helpful, but there are definitely a few kinks that we need to work out.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thinking about the CARES Act, before we move on to some specific policies, is there any one thing you definitely want to see repeated in future recovery packages, or is there any one thing you want to make sure we don't replicate?
Well, I think the CARES Act was really sort of a one-shot deal, is because the whole system had to move very quickly. And from a Republican perspective, what I would hope is that we look at this is that there's a shared responsibility. Catherine talked about the rainy day funds that are at states. That's somewhat, I think, inconsistent between the states. Some states are in better positions than others, and also the localities themselves have much more sizable rainy day funds established in their general revenue or general fund surpluses. So I'd like to see sort of a shared approach, because the federal government's the only one here that's broke, and completely so. I think we need to look at cutting costs and sharing the responsibility for helping institutions, and not put it all on the expectation of the federal government.
Thanks, Jeff. Thinking about, the CARES was the first strike. We now saw the HEROES Act brought forth in the House. Taking it to James, what do you see as the positive for state finances and higher education in the House bill that just passed? Maybe some big points of concern or negatives. And what do you think is really going to be the heated flashpoints as this gets discussed on the Hill for higher ed?
Thank you, Janine, and thanks for co-hosting this with us and Chio. Really appreciate it, the opportunity to be here. The House passed bill is, it's a very ambitious effort that I think is equal to the challenge that our economy faces. It's something like a $3 trillion bill that includes a total of $1 trillion for state fiscal relief, other steps to prop up the economy through unemployment insurance, small businesses, and on and on. And so obviously propping up the economy is really important to the state budget situation. And if people are spending money, they're paying taxes, businesses are paying taxes, people are making money. That's a really important. With respect to the higher ed provision specifically, The bill includes $37 billion for higher education. About 3/4 of that is earmarked for states for public institutions. That's about roughly proportionate to where the students are. And we think that's really important. The CARES Act sent all the money out directly to institutions. And that really overlooks how important states are as part of our higher education system. And, if you look broadly over the course of the last few decades, every time there is a downturn, for the reasons Catherine mentioned, you see states cutting higher education disproportionately, and then they don't put the money back in good times. And by and large, colleges still had not recovered from the Great Recession. And here another one comes along, and tuitions get higher, student debt gets higher. So it's really important that federal money go to states, and ask states to have a responsibility so that we're not just pushing on a string and seeing debt and tuition go up, despite how aggressively the federal government is responding. You're muted. I can't hear your question.
It was bound to happen once. I'm with you, Dr. Johnson. So speaking of these approaches, in the CARES Act, there actually was a sort of maintenance of effort provision for states. Can you tell us a little bit how that's been operationalized, and maybe what does that mean for policy approaches like the federal-state partnership?
Well, you're right. There are provisions in the HEROES Act. So I think the first question is, will the Senate consider that funding structure of sending money through states, or will it use the CARES structure to construct the colleges? If the Senate does maintain this basic structure, there's likely to be some kind of maintenance of effort. And the House proposes three different kinds of provisions. One would say all of education can't get cut disproportionately. So understanding everyone needs to contribute, shared sacrifice here, but don't make higher ed the piggy bank like it has been in years past. The second way of structuring this would put a floor under higher education. That's the average of the last 3 years. So you could roll back some of the increases maybe that states got in FY20, but you could only cut so much. And then the third maintenance of effort would require states to put money back in when the economy recovers. Now the bill says 2021. Maybe it would have been better to tie it to an economic indicator. But the idea is when states are able to put money back in, they bring funding back up on a per student basis to where it was in 2019. So those are three different ways of structuring it. They all have their pros and cons, but I do think it is really important that we break the cycle here of states retrenching from higher education and college costs getting higher and higher every time we go through an economic cycle.
Thank you, James. That leads us to thinking about economic cycles, and I know a lot of folks are hoping that and wondering what colleges are doing in the fall and how that will affect higher education budgets for the next fiscal year. Chancellor Greenstein, just throwing it out there, if your institutions were to go or remain viral in the fall, how would that affect finances across the state system?
No, that wouldn't be good. But, at the end of the day, this is a public health issue. And, you got to ask yourself about the rationale behind, bringing thousands of students from all across the nation, actually from all across the world, into small and large communities. And what are we trying to accomplish here? And I'm particularly concerned about some of the issues that have been raised. Two in particular, there's a huge variation in the range of universities and colleges with respect of their the liquidity that they have, their cushion against this shock. Those that can cushion themselves, have a range of different options they can consider for the fall. I would hate to see universities race back to face-to-face instruction because it's the economically right thing to do, because we're putting lives at risk. So I guess that's point number one. Point number two is where that puts lives at risk. Point number two is, I guess, The university, the students that that disproportionately attend those institutions which have the least financial cushion are also the underserved students, low-income students, students of color, rural students. So there's a potential here that by approaching recovery in a purely market-driven way, and let's be clear, we are approaching recovery in a market-driven way. The assumption is that those who can will, and if they can keep their customers and employees safe, they'll do fine, and those that can't will be somehow swept by the wayside. There is an opportunity in this sector that approach will exacerbate, not introduce, the inequalities that already exist. And that concerns me, I guess, as a citizen more than even as an educator, but it concerns me.
Thank you, Dan. Those great insights. Well, we have talked a lot about the potential for institutions to see decreased enrollment. There are some expectations that some sectors, as we head into the recovery phase, might actually find uptakes. Dr. Johnson, during the Great Recession, there were large upswings in community college enrollment as workers were looking for new opportunities. Do you anticipate a similar increase once folks are moving out in the open again? Oh, I think we have you muted.
It's a very good question, one that we grapple with on a daily basis. Before I get into answering that, though, I think the chancellor brought up an important point that is very instructive to all of us, and that has to do with the rush by some institutions to get students back at their schools this coming fall. And there are several who have actually changed the semester's timeline so that students can get out by Thanksgiving. And I think what they're doing is banking on the fact that their populations are fairly young and maybe resistant to COVID-19, which I think is not a lucid argument. And then secondly, that they are considering a spike in COVID at that time as well. So I think the precautionary tone that the chancellor is taking with this system is a very, very good one indeed. But with respect to your question, would we see enrollment spikes as a result of COVID that occurred during the financial crisis? That's the $64,000 question. A couple of things you have to really, really take into consideration. Number one, there's still a lot of angst and apprehension about individuals gathering together in groups. That has to be taken into consideration. I think the other thing that's important is that there is some type of financial reward out there that needs to be exhausted before individuals really get a sense that they might be affected financially in a more significant way by COVID. So I think that period has to pass. And I do believe that there will be some growth, particularly in short-term training, workforce development, when you look at jobs that will be available post-COVID, most notably in information technology, manufacturing, and healthcare. The return to service-oriented jobs may be a little bit, later on. Also, during the Great Recession, there were states did not have the resources or the revenue to invest in colleges and universities, even though there were enrollment upswings. So the revenue that you received as an institution was through tuition, not through any type of state subsidy or any subsidy. The only thing that was available that provided additional opportunity was through the federal government and some of the grants that were available there. Once those were pulled back, then you saw a decline in allocations to colleges and universities. This is a totally different environment indeed. My hope is that we can get more individuals back into an institution in a meaningful and safe way. But we do believe that if we don't experience enrollment growth in the fall, perhaps we'll see some growth this coming in the spring of 2021.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That brings me to kind of a final thought. I'm going to put a question and round robin it to both Jeff and Dan. We're talking about keeping students in programs, making sure they have pathways, success to completion. But we also know that countless colleges and universities were already on the brink of financial closure prior to the crisis, and that many of these schools provided little to no return on investment for their students. Should we be saving schools that were on the brink of closure before the health crisis? And I'll pass that over to Jeff first.
Sorry about that. I was almost going to start without unmuting. The situation that we had, the trends that we had pre-COVID are going to be here post-COVID, and I think one of the issues that I have always had in this and stressed is that I think we inefficiently distribute our state funding to higher education by providing too much institutional support. I think if we provided more based on like a Pell Grant type situation where it was a voucher and the money went with the students, we wouldn't have some of these situations where we have publicly funded failure factories around in different sectors and institutions that continually struggling, and it's a death by 1,000 cuts type of situation. But I think moving forward, and I would take exception with the president and the chancellor on this. I do think we do need to open up institutions and open up institutions in a safe way. And if you look at, for example, President Mitch Daniels at Purdue, I think they've put together a very logical, science-based approach, and where they've taken the mitigation strategies and applied them, very smartly in a way that they can open. It's not going to be the same as it was back in January, but it's a way to move forward. And our firm, we work a lot with folks in the military, and the military has a phrase called Oscar Mike, stay frosty. And what that means is, we're on the move, stay alert, stay on your toes. And I think as we enter this other side of the pandemic, that's the approach that we need to take.
Thank you, Jeff. Dan, did you have any final thoughts about preventing school closures for schools on the brink before the crisis? Oh, I think we have you muted.
No, I have myself muted. This is a policy question. What is education? What are we funded for? Are we funded to say, I'm going to say it because here we are. Are we funded to save jobs? Or are we funded to educate students? And the answer could be both, but we're not funded to that level. So, these are the kind of policy questions that our state and federal governments have to address themselves to. And absent that, we're going to have to make really hard choices with the limited number of public dollars that are available.
Thank you, Dan. That concludes my questions for our panel. So I think that leads us really nicely into some questions from the audience. I do want to let our viewers know, it looks like we might just run a couple minutes over on the questions, but please stay with us if you like. The video will be up on our webpage and in YouTube. So thinking about balancing liability, students' health, the goals and policies for economic recovery. I direct this to my institutional members, chancellors, and presidents. What opportunities might exist during this time for cooperation between public and private institutions to help weather the crisis? Do you see any specific opportunities for collaboration between public and private schools?
Well, why don't I take an opportunity to respond to that first, and then of course Dan, who is responsible for entire system of institutions, might have a more global response. It is not unusual for community colleges, for example, to collaborate with institutions for a lot of reasons. Specific among them is the fact that our students expect to transfer to those institutions following their graduation. So there are not only the general transfer programs, but there are specific programs that students can engage with four-year institutions and really round out their experience with the baccalaureate degree. Under these circumstances, however, I believe that all of post-secondary education has a tremendous role, not only to promote the economic well-being of our communities, to make sure that there are appropriate programs that address workforce needs, but also to serve as a convener, communicators, to ensure that the communities that they serve get what they need in order to be successful, and that they have a knowledge about what types of educational programs that are available, but they also are informed about how to respond appropriately to COVID. So there's much room for collaboration, not only in the general ways that we have experienced in the past, but in the more specific ways around community engagement, communications, leading community response, promoting the economic well-being, and becoming economic drivers of the economy, as opposed to institutions that depend on it, with response to what James shared with us earlier in his conversation.
Thank you. Dan, did you have any
just about maybe one gloss? I mean, there's some immediate opportunities to share in some of the, the safety procedures. I think of things like testing and quarantine capability and surge space for need for quarantine or contact tracing. Those are, we're talking about keeping students safe. Those are the kinds of things that, absent fully funded availability, state or federal funded availability of those services, these are beyond the reach of most institutions acting on their own. They may be beyond the reach of institutions acting collaboratively, but they'll have a better chance collaboratively than they would on their own. So even in the fall or beyond, there's some real regional opportunities, which are quite important, I think.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Another question that was submitted in, I'm hoping, Catherine, you might be able to speak to this. Some of our audience is wondering, why all of the funding decisions focus on FTE, how that's calculated, and are there other good measures of state investment or wealth when it comes to higher education funding?
Sure. So I would say that actually the way we look at and collect data on support for higher ed, since we do look at the whole picture of state budgets, is we focus on things like share of general fund spending, and general fund being the bucket of money that states have the most just control over, and that's funded by broad-based taxes for the most part, like sales and personal income. So as you look at higher ed as a share of the overall budget, that is one alternative measure that we often turn to. And it is true that higher ed's share of general fund spending has gone down in recent decades, and for a lot of the reasons, echoing what Chancellor Malloy had talked about earlier about rising spending in more mandatory areas of the budget.
Awesome. Thank you. That helps give some context. James, I'm going to see if this won't be a good one to toss your way. Folks are wondering about the role and security of adjunct professors, but I'm wondering if you could also just talk more broadly about, what are you seeing and hearing on the ground from your partners about who works at these institutions, who's being the most impacted?
Yeah, certainly adjuncts are a concern, and a lot of them are in a period of great uncertainty and do not have a lot of economic resources to fall back on. Same could be said for a lot of people who are employed as contractors, people who staff auxiliary operations, people who clean the building. There's just a lot of staff whose questions are in jeopardy, whose situations are in jeopardy. And, I think it does really highlight the value in propping up colleges and universities during a downturn, because they're both centers of economic activity in and of themselves. They support their employees, their students, their communities, but they also serve a really important function in helping to drive the recovery and helping us come back stronger. And the jobs that are being destroyed, often low-skilled jobs, may not come back. And if we don't protect our higher ed system, we may end up with even greater inequality than we've had in the past couple of decades.
Thank you, James. We're getting really close. I think we covered most of the topics in the submitted questions. So I'm going to give each of our panelists the mic just one final time to tell us one thing they would like to see considered in any future stimulus or recovery packages. Just one, maximum 4 sentences. I'm going to call you out in the order I see you on my screen. So I'm going to start us off with Catherine.
Sure. So I would just stress the need for timely, flexible, and sufficient federal fiscal aid to states. There will be a need for shared sacrifice, as was talked about. States will need to tap reserves and cut spending. But without additional federal aid, the severity of budget cuts that will be necessary in order for states to balance their budgets will undoubtedly hurt residents and dampen the economic recovery that will be so necessary. And states also, are going to need certainty as they plan and adjust their budgets for this year and the coming years. So the timeliness factors is crucial as well.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll toss it off the mic to Jeff. One thing you'd like to see the federal government respond to in the next legislation?
Just one?
Just one. We're just giving you only one guy for now.
I mean, my recommendation is actually not to the federal government, but to the states. I think states need to look at a number of factors within their tax base, because this is like Groundhog Day every time there's some type of a decrease in consumer spending or unemployment, where we keep going back and having the same arguments. I think in this particular case, however, we don't have the situation where we have a bunch of students coming into the system, so it's a double whammy on the schools. But again, I think we need to be moving towards money that moves with students, that helps sort out the marketplace, so we have a consumer driven system rather than one that's determined by that's centrally planned.
Thank you, Jeff. Next on my screen is President Johnson. One thing you'd like to see in the next recovery package?
Well, my point is that I believe that states have acted in really good faith and not only responding to the recovery, but also ensuring that individuals affected by COVID get an opportunity to be financially whole. So I want to commend those governors across the nation that have done that. But I do believe in the midst of this crisis, there need to be some type of federal stabilization. That's why the HEROES Act is so very, very important indeed. And my hope is that it does not get swallowed in the Senate.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. Next up on my list, Chancellor Greenstein. One recommendation.
Thanks very much. The path to recovery is built on testing and contact tracing. And I don't know if that's a federal or state thing, but
thank you.
The alternative is a public health issue. So let's go to testing.
And then to round us out, James, one big idea for federal policy response.
Well, we haven't talked about student debt at all. Student debt has tripled since the last recession. And there's a whole new set of hardships being created around that. And I think offering relief to students who can't afford their payments is both a measure to help struggling families and to prop up the economy. But sorry to break the rules. I really do think supporting public higher education is so important right now for the short-term economy, for the long-term type of society we want to live in. And it's really important, I think, in particular, to make sure that students who want on-campus learning opportunities with all the enrichment that comes with that can afford that choice as well as an online choice.
Thank you, James. I believe that brings our time together to a close. So another round of thank yous to all our panelists and our partners. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Tika, Shio, BPC, or any of the presenters today. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon as we collectively work to find policy solutions that can help states address the higher education systems for faculty, staff, students, and families during this crisis and on the road to recovery. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.